Racial bias in the U.S. justice system. This is my topic for my persuasive research essay, and this is my research spotlight, in which I'll kind of be dissecting it and breaking it down for you in just a couple of minutes. The most important aspect of my essay is that I need to convince you that racial bias exists in the U.S. in a systematic way. If I can convince you of that, I can convince you of the real harm it causes. Racism can be a sticky subject because if you're a white individual, you may not see it. You may be blind to the subtle racism in the everyday. This is not because of some personal fault, but more so because of how modern society has carefully conditioned you. Racial bias is an implicit bias, which refers to the attitudes or stereotypes that affect an individual's understanding, actions, and decisions in an unconscious manner. I want to emphasize that it's an implicit bias. Implicit bias is a form of bias that occurs automatically and unintentionally that nevertheless affects judgments, decisions, and behaviors. I remind you of this so you can understand that we all have these biases and they're often not intentional. Despite that, it is still our responsibility as we grow as people to dissect and face those biases head on. Because implicit bias can be so subtle, it can be hard for us to quantitatively prove its effects. Its subtle nature sneaks into everything we do, like your jobs, your hobbies, who you date, etc. In my essay, I'm specifically discussing the way these biases play into the U.S. justice system. A well-recorded fact is that men of color are incarcerated at much higher rates than their white peers. You might be inclined to say that these people are simply more likely to commit crimes by nature, which would be a stereotype. The reality is that rates of incarceration are not necessarily consistent with rates of crime. What do I mean by that? Well, if you look a little deeper, you'll find that they are incarcerated at higher rates than their white peers for the same crimes. This is where things get interesting. I'd like to remind you of some legal jargon within the U.S. You'll recall that the U.S., like many countries, utilized slave labor and disenfranchised many minority groups. Historically, those slaves have been made up of people of color, specifically African Americans. Something you may not know is that our modern police force was founded on what was called the Slave Patrol. The Slave Patrol was made to prevent slave uprisings and return runaway slaves to their owners, and this was in effect until about the passing of the 13th and 14th Amendment in the 19th century. I ask that you consider one more thing, which is that the 13th Amendment of the U.S. Constitution states, "Neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States, or any place subject to their jurisdiction." The important part here is, except as a punishment for a crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted. Slavery is allowed as punishment for a crime. This is called penal labor. I should note at the time of this assignment that some state governments have voted that even this should be illegal, which is a great step forward. That being said, you may be shocked at how many corporations use prison slave labor. While some prisons pay their prisoners minuscule wages, in Alabama, Arkansas, Georgia, Mississippi, and Texas, they do not. For those who do pay, the average wage is 52 cents per hour. Companies that you might know that use penal labor include Walmart, Starbucks, and Wendy's. I want to bring one more thing to your attention. The U.S. prison system is notorious for its readmittance rates. We know that our prison system creates worse outcomes for those who go through it, mentally, physically, emotionally, psychologically, financially. Our current system often fails to rehabilitate prisoners and help them return to normal life. Because of this, prisoners often leave and come right back because they have no money, nowhere to live, and no resources. Not only that, but all but 2 states have what is called a pay-to-stay law, which makes prisoners pay for their time behind bars. So not only do they have nothing, but now they owe thousands of dollars in debt. These prisons have no incentive to change this because they're privatized and make money off of it. They benefit from people being in jail. To make it even worse, there are laws that prevent felons from voting. Depending on the state, you may not be able to vote after being charged with felony at all. You can only vote after being out for so long, or you can't vote during your prison stay. So why does this matter? Well, when you have an entire minority group being incarcerated at higher rates and being charged more harshly for crimes, then you have an entire minority group being disenfranchised, being used for slave labor, and either ending up back in jail to continue that cycle, or in poverty-stricken areas, or even homelessness after their stay. Poor communities also tend to have higher rates of crime. Can you see where I'm going with this? Add to it the implicit bias that police might have against these communities or quote-unquote ghettos, and the picture will start to stitch itself together. We have a perpetual system of prison labor and disenfranchisement of minority groups in this country. How can we expect people of color to succeed in this country when they're at such a huge disadvantage? Who might be benefiting from this corrupt system? How do we change it? It starts with awareness. Once we see what's happening, we can take action. Like I mentioned before, some states very recently changed their laws regarding penal labor. It's worth mentioning, though, that there were states that voted on it and didn't stop prison labor. People legitimately voted to allow us to continue to use prison slave labor. Who would do that, and why? I want to encourage you to share this information with anyone you can. We need this to change. It's not fair for anyone to get abused in the system this way. And it's time to speak up against it. It's time to go vote and change this legislation because it is inherently harmful. Thank you.